The end of the Union is nigh. Well, perhaps not right now, but with 45% of Scottish voters choosing to secede from the United Kingdom, it cannot be far off. Britain, once a tightly knit multinational state at the heart of a global empire, is now a centrifuge. For pro-independence voters in Scotland, the breakup of the UK was a means toward democracy, social justice, and the end of austerity. It was a way to protect the remnants of the welfare state and the National Health Service from Westminster cuts. How have the British media represented this battle? Have they contemplated Scotland's democratic dilemmas with the maturity, seriousness and objectivity that, after all, characterises all of our newspapers and broadcasters? Here is a clue. Selfish Scots don't know how lucky they are, says Melanie Reid in The Times. They're addicted to welfare and they want the something-for-nothing society, says Simon Heffer in The Spectator. And what about Alex Salmond, the leader of the Scottish National Party, a gambler and a former Maoist rabble-rouser who favoured direct action, says the Daily Mail. The Telegraph, for its part, compared him to Robert Mugabe. But perhaps this is too easy. Jock-bashing has long been a pastime of right-wing English pundits, similar to the regional loathing that is applied to Wales and the north of England. It is arguably a proxy for class hatred and has always played a part in Britishness. But in fact, most of the British media, from the most conservative, the Daily Mail, to the most liberal, the Guardian, adopted the traditional unionist position associated with one of the Westminster parties, be it the Tories or Labour. Not only that, but those media which have no party political allegiance, such as the BBC and the business press, were arguably even more pro-union than the rest. In the UK, the only major media openly supporting independence was the Scottish Herald. Why should this be? Let's begin with the BBC and its famous impartiality and objectivity. Scottish independence campaigners entertain a particular boiling contempt for the corporation, seeing it as a loyal mouthpiece of the establishment and the Westminster parties. Protests have taken place outside BBC headquarters over its alleged anti-independence bias. For example, the widely read Wings Over Scotland blog pointed out recently that the BBC's coverage of a mass protest in Glasgow was illustrated by a photo of a tiny clutch of people carrying Yes placards. So are the Yes campaign right about the BBC? An academic study published on Open Democracy suggests that they are. The research noted that while both the major British broadcasters, the BBC and the ITV, or STV in Scotland, were biased against independence, the BBC was, by a significant margin, the more openly hostile to independence. It tended to feature a preponderance of anti-independence statements, a majority of anti-independence evidence, and a heavy personalisation of the debate around the character of Alex Salmond, with the latter often portrayed as selfish and undemocratic. But perhaps the most controversial moment in the campaign was when the BBC's Nick Robinson asked a question of First Minister Salmond about the reported claims that the Royal Bank of Scotland was moving its headquarters to London, implicitly in fear of independence.
Why should a Scottish voter believe you, a politician, against men who are responsible for billions of pounds of profits?
Salmond gave a lengthy answer rebutting this and powerfully indicting BBC bias. However, when Robinson reported the exchange later, he stated that Salmond had not answered the question. Or whatever one thinks of Salmond's rejoinder, Robinson's claim was a lie.
He didn't answer, but he did attack the reporting of those in what he called the metropolitan media.
This is not the first time that such findings have indicted the BBC's reporting. Similar research by the academics Greg Philo and Mike Berry detected systematic pro-Israel bias in the corporation's reporting from Israel-Palestine, which left viewers with a potpourri of utterly false impressions which tended to support the Israeli side. Likewise, research on bias in the media during the build-up to the invasion of Iraq found that the BBC was in fact more loyal to the British government's case for war than the commercial broadcasters, and that included even the pro-establishment media owned by Rupert Murdoch. Why? The BBC is in principle publicly owned and paid for by licence fee holders. It has an explicit commitment to neutrality in its reporting. But it is also an arm of the British state, linked to and dependent upon the authorities in Westminster for its news. Apart from the BBC, the business press was perhaps the most vociferously anti-independence wing of the British media. This is unsurprising. A British Chambers of Commerce survey found that 85% of UK businesses thought that Scotland should remain in the UK. So with business elites rallying behind the UK and the independence campaign strongest in working class areas of Glasgow and Dundee, it seems that there is a clear class division here. The Economist distinguished itself as the voice of business. It ran a series of scare stories warning in one famous cover that Scotland would become Skintland, from the high-interest lands to the lone lands, from Glasgow to Edinburgh. Another cover featured a fairly standard 19th century depiction of a jock with saltire face paint, ginger wig and tartan get-up. This was its representation of foolish Braveheart nationalism, as if Scottish voters were blind, irrational patriots hypnotised by the St Andrew's Cross, proving that the publication failed to understand the movement it was set against. Even supporters of the No campaign, such as the former First Minister Henry McLeish, have been embarrassed by the publication's patronising disdain for Scottish voters. Nonetheless, the points it made were widely shared in the business press. An independent Scotland would be a small nation in a turbulent world, susceptible to financial shocks, with higher borrowing costs, and overly dependent upon oil revenues for the Scandinavian-style welfare state that Alex Salmond promised. And indeed, these points, lathered with falsehood, were repeated by rote in the No campaign's literature. Of course, there should be no doubt that the London-based capitalist press, from the Financial Times to City AM to The Economist, are primarily concerned about the well-being of ordinary Scottish citizens. Nonetheless, there are other reasons for them to be concerned. After all, the breakup of Britain has profound consequences for the capital invested in Britain, and particularly for the global prominence of the City and London as a hub of international finance. As City AM put it, reporting on the worries of London-based banks, a yes vote would lead to a sharp hit to sterling, and even with a no victory of around 55%, the resulting background hum of political uncertainty could prove damaging. Sterling and gilt investors should take note. Still, business might have been reluctant to play its role too openly. In a post-referendum report on the No campaign, the Financial Times disclosed that it required a last-minute push by David Cameron, including a reception in Downing Street and a series of phone calls described as very persuasive. Such arm-twisting resulted in a string of businesses issuing warnings about independence, which the media faithfully amplified. In a way, one could argue that the commercial media have every reason to align with the concerns of business and the government. They are, after all, barring the BBC, businesses themselves. They rely on advertising revenue from other businesses. Their editors move in the same circles as businessmen and statesmen. Westminster politicians have easy access to the press in a way that yes voters on Glasgow council estates really don't. But then there is a complexity in all this, and that is the position of Murdoch's organ, The Sun. While The Sun is a traditionally conservative paper ever since Mrs Thatcher took the leadership of the Conservative Party, it has not been as predictably loyal in this case. On the contrary, the Scottish Sun shifted from being a determined opponent of independence to being an ally of Alex Salmond after the SNP's sweeping election victory in 2011. However, on the brink of the referendum, the Scottish Sun did not choose to back independence, instead taking an uncharacteristically equivocal view, stating that it trusted Scottish voters to make the right choice. What explains this peculiar position on the part of Murdoch's mouthpiece? Put most simply, business. While the BBC is ultimately loyal to the British state, the Sun is ultimately loyal to its proprietors' profits, which it exists to serve. Murdoch makes a habit of backing winners, just as he did when his paper switched to supporting Labour before its landslide election victory in 1997. And after the News of the World scandal and the hacking inquiries, he seemed to need every friend he could get. And after all, an independent Scotland might not be too bad for his profits. The SNP had, in a bid to make an independent state competitive, pledged to reduce corporation taxes. At the final hurdle, Murdoch reverted to his former self, worrying about the far left and the Greenies who had been energised by the independence campaign. And those popular energies, it seems likely, is what most of the media were really frightened by. 45% of Scottish voters ultimately backed independence. Nothing like 45% of the British media supported that outcome. So how did the ideas and information that led to people becoming mobilised for yes actually spread? There were, in fact, grassroots campaigns, door-knocking, leafleting, and public meetings. But the internet really threw a spanner in the traditional works of the media. Studies show that most social media buzz around the referendum was coming from yes supporters, overwhelmingly concentrated in Glasgow, one of the 4 areas in Scotland to vote yes. And indeed, there are a host of popular blogs and websites dedicated to making the case for independence and highlighting the falsehoods and propaganda of the mainstream media. To that extent, if the yes vote was a rejection of the Westminster elite, that elite includes the London-based media.